This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Are human beings made for monogamy or non-monogamy? This is a popular subject of debate. For example, some argue that humans evolved for monogamy in order to ensure parental investment in our offspring because human babies need a lot of care for a long time in order to survive. At the same time, others argue that humans evolved to be non-monogamous because it increases the odds of reproductive success and increases genetic diversity in our species. So, which is it? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of the topics we're going to dive into include the difference between social monogamy and sexual monogamy, because these things frequently get conflated, but they're actually two very different things, and they don't necessarily go together in humans or in animals. We'll also talk about some of the problems with drawing conclusions about how human mating strategies evolved by comparing us to other primates. We're also going to discuss the role of oxytocin in brain chemistry and how that relates to monogamy and non-monogamy. I am joined by Nathan Lentz, a professor of biology at John Jay College, where he is the director of the Cell and Molecular Biology program. His research lab studies human genetic evolution and forensic DNA technology. He also writes popular science articles and is the author of Not So Different: Finding Human Nature in Animals, as well as Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches, from pointless bones to broken genes. His latest book is titled The Sexual Evolution: How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you looking for a space that celebrates diverse perspectives, explores new frontiers, and brings all of your favorite people together? The annual Sexological Conference, hosted by Sexual Health Alliance, is where sexuality leaders gather. This conference connects you with world-class experts, leading sexuality companies, and a community of like-minded, passionate, and welcoming professionals. You'll find your people at the Sexual Health Alliance Annual Sexological Conference this October. Get your ticket to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Note that this conference is open to anyone and everyone. Head over to sexualhealthalliance.com, select the Annual Sexological Conference page, and save your spot today. Hi, Nathan, and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Justin.
Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about your work. All right, so what we're going to be talking about in this episode is the ongoing debate over whether humans are meant to be monogamous or non-monogamous. You know, there's a lot of research that seems to be in conflict over this question, with some suggesting that we evolved for monogamy and other work suggesting that we evolved for non-monogamy. And I think your new book, The Sexual Evolution, can help to shed some much-needed light here. But as a starting point, I think we need to acknowledge that there have been some flaws in early research because a lot of folks have conflated social monogamy with sexual monogamy, which are actually two different things. So what's the difference between social monogamy and sexual monogamy, and why is this important to understand?
It's absolutely essential to understand. I'm so glad that you asked that first, because usually I have to back up when I get this question to define social monogamy versus sexual monogamy. So sexual monogamy is exactly what it sounds like: an exclusive sexual relationship to the exclusion of all others and having just that bilateral sexual contact in that restricted way. That's what most people mean when they talk about monogamy. But social monogamy, or sometimes called economic monogamy, is pair bonding. So it's the tendency of animals or humans to form tight pair bonds for an extended period, if not the entire lifespan, usually with the purpose of raising offspring. And so you have a homestead that is shared together, whether it's a nest or a den or a home of some kind, and shared resources. So food provisioning and other things like that are shared equally. And that relationship sort of enjoys a primacy in both individuals' lives. It's not that they don't have other relationships, but it's the key, most central relationship that an animal or human has. That's social monogamy. And the idea that sexual monogamy automatically flows, that's really just a human thing. In most other creatures out there, sexual monogamy is not very common at all. And when you do find it, you find it in very particular instances. So Birds are really the masters of monogamy. They tend to form these very tight pair bonds that can last for years, their whole lifespan. But what we found beginning in the 1980s when DNA testing was invented is that they're almost never sexually exclusive. And that is sometimes without any sort of deception or conflict or anything. And sometimes there is. Sometimes they do try to restrict one another's sexual activity for various reasons, but it's almost never successful. But let's leave birds aside for a second. And if we really want to focus on human psychology, we really need to look at other mammals. And unfortunately, for those of us who are interested in monogamy, almost no mammals are sexually exclusive. I think 8 mammal species have been discovered to be sexually monogamous, or sometimes called genetically monogamous, meaning their offspring are only with each other. And that's 8 out of something like 6,000 species of mammals. And then most of those are primates. And primates tend to pair bond a little bit more often than mammals. But to be honest, mammals aren't even good pair bonders. Most mammals don't pair bond at all. They have kind of a freewheeling social life as an adult, including sexual life. And only about 9% of all mammals, but about 15% of all primates do form stable pair bonds. One thing about humans, and everyone wants to know, well, how does this apply to us? Well, one thing is clear is that we do form pair bonds. So humans do have a tendency to pair up. That's not strictly universal, but it's pretty common, pretty cross-culturally found throughout different historical periods. There is this tendency to pair up. So I would say that we are a socially monogamous species. Of course, there's always exceptions, and that's true in animals as well, but we are mostly monogamous. Now, so the real question is, are we a sexually monogamous species? Are we evolved or designed to be sexually monogamous? I have a very clear answer for you. The answer is yes and no. and people always get frustrated. But what I mean is there's really strong evidence that we do have some sexual monogamy in our past, but we also have evidence that we've been evolving out of that sexual monogamy. So what does it mean for us? Well, the good news is that humans are the ultimate generalists. We are omnivores, both literally, but also in every sense of the word, in that we are not built for one kind of lifestyle, one kind of living, one way of succeeding, one way of using the environment, one diet, one biome even. We can live in the desert, we can live in the tundra, we can live in rainforest, grasslands, we can live in all kinds of environments and survive on all kinds of foods. And the same is true for our social and sexual relationships. We are built to be flexible, adaptable, and to adjust to the environment because we are, among all species, the most what we call niche constructors, meaning we don't just enter an environment and react to it. We create our own environment. We transform every environment we go into, and then we thrive in all kinds of various ways. So I don't have a clear answer except to say that it's all okay. There are lots of examples of cultures that have done all kinds of different arrangements and lifestyles and different approaches to sexual relationships, and they thrive. So I don't think that we are programmed for any one, which means that you can be flexible and adaptable. And even throughout your lifespan, you might engage in one way or the other. And none of it's wrong. None of it's maladaptive. None of it's abiological. It's all within our natural capacities. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, and that makes total sense to me. And it's very similar to how I think about this issue. Like, it's never made sense, like this idea that all humans would evolve to have the same mating strategy, right? If we all did, that's going to create a lot of, in the evolutionary sense, a lot of people who would lose out, right? In terms of if we didn't have flexible strategies and people weren't approaching things in different ways, not only would that make it so we weren't adaptable to the environment, but it's also going to mean that you're going to have a large percentage of the population that's not going to succeed when it comes to things like mating.
Very well said. And I think that another thing that makes us special is we are so good at cooperative lifestyle. So we live in a social environment with division of labor and alloparenting. Alloparenting means caring for children that are not your own genetically and that you're aware of that are not your own genetically. We have no problem caring for other children, whether in schools or daycares or babysittings or even just, helping a friend out. And that's another thing you don't see in a lot of other animals. So we are uniquely cooperative, uniquely flexible and adaptable. And I think that the one size fits all, that just doesn't work for us. I'm not sure how well it works for other animals either, but for humans especially, one size does not fit all.
Very true. And I like this distinction that you make between social and sexual monogamy. And, as applied to humans, it makes a lot of sense. While a lot of people certainly are both socially and sexually monogamous, we also have a lot of folks who are only socially monogamous. For example, people who commit infidelity or who are in some type of open relationship. They've built their life with one person, but they're having sex with multiple people. So being monogamous in one way doesn't necessarily mean that you're being monogamous in other ways. And I think this has been a problem in some of the past research where scientists have been looking at different animal species and they're seeing this social monogamy and assuming that that goes along with sexual monogamy. So I think that's why you said, it wasn't until the 1980s that people started kind of questioning this when they were doing that research on birds and found that, oh, yeah, they're socially monogamous, but not necessarily sexually monogamous. So some of this is about us kind of seeing what we want to see in the data or approaching it with a little bit of our own personal bias, right?
100%. A lot of the research on this in other animals was done through very biased perspectives. And you had scientists who looked out in nature and they were just a little too eager to see the ideal of human marriage, lifelong, perpetual, sexually exclusive marriage. And so when they saw these birds who really are devoted to one another, and so it wasn't, a conscious ignorance. It was just, that was what they knew. That was what they experienced. And when something gets, passed down for several generations, you don't question it. And so the idea that you would anthropomorphize other animals, it wasn't intentional. It wasn't evil. These aren't bad scientists. They were doing the best they could. And what they didn't recognize, and what scientists today a lot of times fail to recognize, is that they had a perspective. And anytime you have a perspective, that perspective is limited. It's biased. It's influenced by everything you bring to the table before you even started observing. And we're only really starting to appreciate how biased we all are. There's this mythology that science is this purely objective pursuit. It's all just data collection and it's dispassionate and we don't have any personal views on it. And that's just false. That is completely false because every step of the scientific enterprise, there are choices to be made. What gets studied, how it gets studied, the methodology, what counts. For example, in this context, what counts as sex? What counts as sex? We're not even sure with humans, but let alone other species. And the classic example of this was when people studied giraffes and they would see two male giraffes copulating, having sex with each other, pinning each other down, penetration, anal penetration with orgasm. But that wasn't sex. That was a dominant struggle, But if a male just sniffed a female, that was a sexual interaction, So that's bias. That was that heterosexist bias that came in and said that only procreative sex is real sex and the other stuff, we don't know what it is, but it doesn't matter. Of course, now we're looking at this a lot differently and realizing that all of those are sexual interactions and they're meaningful to the social life of the creatures. And what's great is there's a whole bunch more we can study now. There's a lot left waiting to be discovered now that we've taken those blinders off. Hopefully, going forward, we'll recognize that when you take off one set of blinders, you might very well put on another. So you have to always constantly question. And that's the beauty of the scientific enterprise, is that if we get enough people all looking, the biases will sort of cancel out. They'll have different perspectives. And that's why it is important to have many people doing the science, many different kinds of people doing the science, so that perspectives, it's like if you're looking at an image from one view and you're only getting part of it. So you have to look at it from another perspective, another point of view. So I'd like to think the science on animal behavior is constantly getting better. And I think it is.
Yeah. I think we'd all like to believe that science is a purely objective enterprise, but yeah, there's a lot of subjectivity that creeps into it. And even something like an observational study of animals, well, depending on what you encode as being sex or not, is going to influence the observations that you record and how you talk about them. And, related to this, you mentioned we anthropomorphize a lot. And we also bring a certain moral lens to the way that we view animal behavior too. So for example, in your book, you talk about how terms like cheating or cuckoldry are often applied in descriptions of animal behavior where it's kind of assumed or implied that these animals are being intentionally deceptive in their mating practices. So, I think that's another example of how we kind of bring these biases to the table. It's just that even the simple terms that we use to apply to some of these behaviors might imply something that isn't really there. It's really kind of our own personal sense based on our own human experiences that we're just kind of seeing reflected in animals that may or may not actually be there.
That's right. And when you remove the assumption and just try to observe the behavior on its own terms, that's when you really discover interesting biology. And some of it will end up coming back to that human experience. So like when we replace it or recenter it into the human experience, it actually tells us a more interesting story. So for example, I was talking to you about birds and how they're pair bonding, they're prolific. So we saw it as a model of human marriage. And then we started to understand, as DNA testing made it unavoidable, that they're having sex outside of their pair bond. We call that extra pair copulation. And sometimes it results in extra pair paternity. So we have these clunky words to describe the fact that they sleep around, they sleep with each other. But then when we started watching, we saw interesting things. So let's take the dunnock. This is a bird that has copulation calls. They're very loud in bed, we'll say. And what we found is that the male and female that are a mated pair, they will still try to interfere with each other's extra pair copulations. But the question was always, why? Because now that we look at it more neutrally, there's really nothing to be lost by a male, having sex with other females. Why does the mated female, why does she care if he does that? Well, it turns out that in this species, and which isn't always true for other species, a male that will feed females that he's had sex with, he'll return to them and feed them. The idea being that he's now joined with them in their genetic destiny. So he wants to care for them.
Being a responsible parent.
Yeah, he wants to care for them, even though they're not his mated pair. It's kind of his side bet, right? In the genetic lottery, it's his side bet. And that is what his mated female wants to stop. She doesn't mind that he's spreading the seed, but don't mess with my money, because then that is taking resources away from the home. And isn't that a better parallel to what's gone on in human marriage too? There's a lot of this pretend monogamy or pretend sexual monogamy that's gone on for millennia, for centuries anyway. And if it's kept quiet, if it doesn't embarrass anyone, you're not making payments, you're just sort of stepping out from time to time, it was always kind of tolerated. But when it becomes a problem is when it disrupts the home, when it really destabilizes. And if you think about it, that makes so much more sense. And so as we approach these questions of monogamy now in modern relationships, what I love about this is that each couple can really solve these matters on their own. They can talk about it. They can evolve over time. They can go through different phases of their marriage where some of this is allowed and some of it's not. Sometimes it ends up in a polyamorous situation. You get to all these relationship anarchy. You get no rules, right? Except for there are rules in the relationship, and you can define them for yourselves rather than just receiving the rules from the society surrounding you. And some couples have found this very liberating. It brings them closer. There's a new kind of intimacy. And then others run screaming because the jealousy explodes and all of that. And I often say, like, open relationships are an interesting new opportunity. But please don't think that it gets you out of the drama or the jealousy or the conflict. I mean, that's always going to be there. It's just going to require a more deep sort of communication, which leads, I think, to intimacy, to deeper intimacy, potentially anyway.
Yeah, it's funny. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and the topic of open relationships came up, and this person was like, "Oh, I bet there's a lot of drama in those." And I was like, isn't there a lot of drama in monogamous relationships too? Right?
Exactly.
There's kind of this idea that open relationships or polyamorous relationships are just inherently more complicated. And they are in some ways, but monogamy is also complicated just in other ways. You're always trading one set of problems for another and one set of opportunities for another as well. Hey guys, have you ever wished that your finale had a few more fireworks? Then let me tell you about Load Boost from BB Health. Load Boost is a supplement designed to improve the taste, volume, and overall health of your semen. This doctor-formulated supplement isn't just about performance, it's all about results. Founded in Denver, BB Health takes quality seriously. Made in the USA, NSF certified, and produced in an FDA-registered facility, this isn't the garbage they're selling in your local gas station. They even share their third-party lab results publicly because, unlike some of your exes, they've got nothing to hide. Thousands of guys across all 50 states and 45 countries have already tried Load Boost, and over 88% of the reviews are 4 or 5 stars from verified buyers. It's time to elevate your performance, and thanks to Load Boost, you just might become someone's new favorite performer. Learn more and get yours at loadboost.com. Visit loadboost.com and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes.
I feel the same way. And I think the one thing that open relationships have going for them is that, at least when done properly, we'll say, it does force a lot of communication about feelings, about thoughts, about values. And it can recenter that sort of emotional connection, recognizing that sharing a home together is extremely meaningful, separate from whoever's having sex with whoever, sharing a home and a future and all of that. And it sort of creates a more explicit understanding of the relationship, if that makes sense. Like all these things get ironed out and problems don't get brushed under the rug because they come out and, in these kind of settings. So I often say, like, we can look to animals for advice. And I mean that partially as a joke, but also they help us identify what's important, what we are shaped to do and not do, So I think that animal behavior does help inform us.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to this question of whether humans are meant for monogamy or non-monogamy, I frequently hear people point to a specific animal species, usually a closely related primate, and they look at what they're doing and assume that this is what humans evolved from. But the problem I see with that is that different people point to different primates that have very different mating patterns. So you can kind of find whatever evidence you want to find by selectively picking which animal you're going to compare us to. So I want to get your take on this. So for example, if you look at a book like Sex at Dawn, there's a lot of talk about how bonobos should be our main comparison with humans because we share a lot of genetic overlap. And since they're pretty non-monogamous by nature, it's often taken as evidence that we're also pretty non-monogamous by nature too. So is that true? What do you make of claims like this, where people just point to a specific animal species and say, that's the kind of the origin of this question about monogamy or non-monogamy?
You said it yourself. People pick their favorite primate that gives the result that they want, that they want to apply to the human condition. Because if you look at bonobos, for example, their sister species of chimpanzee, which their sisters be very closely related, and we're equally related to both of them, they're very different in how they apply their social structure. So right away, you're cherry picking between two very closely related species. Whereas, bonobos are matriarchal, female dominated and fairly gregarious and egalitarian, more social harmony, we'll say, not pure social harmony, but whereas the common chimpanzee is very patriarchal, very hierarchical, with a strict dominance ranking system that's done by aggression, actually, it's worked out. And that's not us either, right? We're not really perfect mirrors of either one of those. We have some aspects of both. And then our next close relative that's still alive is gorillas. And they have this harem lifestyle, most gorilla groups, which is also doesn't really kind of mirror us. But then polygynous societies were very common, earlier in our history. So it's not a coincidence, or it's not a conundrum that you can find examples of different kinds of human relationships because, like I said, we are kind of built to do it all. I think the better way to approach this, if you're going to use animals, is to use them to understand an aspect. Like, for example, if you want to study what a nuclear family, a strictly sexually monogamous nuclear family looks like, you can find animals that live like that. And then you can look at all the various forces at play. But you can't use that to look at other aspects. For example, they probably eat very different foods than we do. The coppery titi monkey is one of the ones, and there's a species of gibbon also that people use as a model of the nuclear family. But here's the problem. Those nuclear families live in complete isolation. They don't interact with any other nuclear families. That's the group. And that is definitely not the human experience. Humans are intricately social with these overlapping nested relationships. So those are both very poor models. So there isn't a perfect model. There isn't one that's even close, I would say. But another thing that we can do is look at cultures around the world and throughout historical periods. And once again, what you find is diversity, right? There's all kinds of different relationships. But the way that they approach it tells us a little bit about what's most common. Most cultures care about genetic relatedness, but then there's others that don't. Most cultures are patriarchal and male-dominated, but then there's ones that are female-dominated, matriarchal. So there's always exceptions, and the exceptions help us understand, I think, by contrast, what the consequences of the different kinds of relationships are. If you read a big book about human families around the world, you will end up, confused because they're all over the place, but I think you'll get the real appreciation for the diversity that's possible with our particular genetics. And that's exciting to me because the fact that there's no right answer also means that there's no wrong answer. As long as you're being nice to one another, you're being kind, you're being honest, you're not being deceptive, manipulative, I think there's infinite ways to build a family.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of oxytocin in monogamy. There's a lot of research on this adorable little creature called the prairie vole, which is a very monogamous pair bonded species. And it shows that oxytocin is really key in forming bonds between partners. So when you tinker with their oxytocin by blocking it, this species that is very monogamous by nature suddenly becomes very promiscuous. So I wondered if you could help us to better understand the role of oxytocin in monogamy, especially as it applies to humans. So could it be, for example, that different people just have different neurochemistry that predisposes them to being more monogamous or more non-monogamous?
It's certainly possible. That hasn't been studied a great deal in humans, but it has been studied, as you mentioned, in the voles. And they have been able to manipulate vole species into or out of monogamy based on oxytocin and vasopressin, two very closely related neuropeptides, and their receptors too. And actually, most of the experiments are done with the receptors. And so you have these, I would call them dials, like volume controls, where you can turn up or down the strength of a pair bond using these hormones and their signaling mechanisms. And people have done this in voles, and they've been able to literally within a day switch a vole into very tightly preferring its mate, its paired mate, or completely forgetting about that relationship and, as you said, becoming fully promiscuous. And I mean socially promiscuous, because they're always pretty sexually promiscuous. And people at first were very excited by this result. They thought, well, we should give this to humans who are undergoing marriage counseling for fidelity issues. If we give them some oxytocin. Here's the problem. There's always a dark side to these things, right?
Yep.
So what we've found is that the tight bonding that you have to another individual often comes to the exclusion of other people. And whether or not voles do this or not, humans have a tendency to define in-group and out-groups. So there's us and there's other. And oxytocin seems to be involved in that as well. So as you turn up someone's pair bond, you can also make them xenophobic, racist, more jealous, and whatever they identify as outgroup becomes amplified and becomes stronger. So those early clinical trials were very quickly abandoned. And in fact, they even resulted in domestic abuse because the jealousy kind of goes off the charts. So you could think of, and this is going to be controversial what I say, but you can think of pair bonding as possessiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That's there. It's sort of unavoidably there, because if it's mine, that means it's not yours. And so we always will act to protect what's ours. And so you have to be very careful with this oxytocin vasopressin. Of course, it was a good idea to try it, but we ended up right back where we started is, well, maybe we should just talk these issues through rather than looking for an injection that will help us. Oxytocin has not lived up to all its hype as a treatment, but as understanding the relationship, the neurochemistry of the relationship, that research is ongoing. It's getting more and more interesting all the time. And in fact, prairie voles are part of the reason they're a good model is there's a whole bunch of very closely related voles. So these are like small little mice, right? And they have close relatives that some are monogamous, some are not. So they have very little genetic difference besides that. So you can kind of isolate it as a variable, which is something you don't really have the opportunity of doing, especially with humans, but with lots of other creatures. You can't isolate variables usually like that. So we've learned a lot about the pair bond from studying voles. And most of it agrees with what I said at the very beginning of this interview, was that humans really are built for pair bonding. We have this tendency to form dyads with someone, particularly someone that we're having sex with. And it becomes a relationship that's really above all others. I often put it this way, like you will share underwear and a toothbrush with someone if you're sleeping with them, right?
Sometimes.
Right? Yeah, well, maybe, yeah. But you wouldn't with a sibling or anybody else that you really care about and you're close to, a work colleague, a parent, a sibling, but you wouldn't share their toothbrush, right? Or their underwear, or you wouldn't want to sleep in the bed with them, even non-sexually, I mean. So there is something different about a sexual relationship, even if it's casual, even if it's not, exclusive, it's very limited. It still has that kind of intimacy that isn't the same as other kinds of friendships. So I think it's worth exploring and studying. As a scientist, that's what we do. We always want to peel the onion and just find out why we are this way. And because doing experiments on humans is, of course, not ethical, the best we can do is try to look in other animals and turn those dials and see how much of it applies to us. But oxytocin is one of those ones that we studied it in other animals long before we ever discovered it in humans. So we know more about pair bonding in other animals than we do about humans.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine if we were administering oxytocin to prevent infidelity? Like, here, you got to take your daily dose of this drug to make sure you don't cheat on your partner. It raises a lot of fascinating and interesting ethical and other implications. We did an episode on the show a long time ago. I think this was back in like before episode 20, it was on love drugs and, kind of this idea about different ways that we can kind of hack our brains to get us to do what it is that we want to do. And that could be changing impulses to cheat. It could be changing our neurochemistry in a way that's going to reduce pathological jealousy, changing our physiological response to traumatic memories in a way that makes them so that they become less vivid and less visceral. So, I think in a lot of ways, we're trying to fight against our biology all the time. And we like to look to drugs and medications as, kind of being the answer. But as you mentioned with oxytocin, it's a complex drug with complicated effects. And there's always going to be trade-offs. Like, yeah, my partner doesn't cheat on me anymore, but now he's a racist. It's like...
Yeah, exactly. But on the other side of that, there are drugs that I think could help in the therapeutic setting. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea is that you can change your brain chemistry. It's slow, it's difficult, it takes a lot of effort, but you can change the way your mind works, in limited ways. People have gotten over phobias this way, right? By just, incremental exposures and then sitting with those feelings, understanding them, and then you move forward and all that. Well, what is that if not manipulating your own brain chemistry? You're doing it the old-fashioned way, but the result is the same. That's where the impulse comes to say, maybe we can tweak these things in a quicker pharmaceutical way. But here's a radical idea, which is now, I think, caught on, is that psychedelic drugs can often accomplish that same thing.
Yep.
And I don't know if you're a recreational drug user, but sometimes if you go on a psychedelic trip with a friend or a partner or a group of people, you come out of it with a different understanding of each other. It's almost like you bare your soul in this way. And for some reason, one thing I've noticed about psychedelics is that the judgmentalism just goes out the window, even about yourself. Like, I've realized some things about myself that I'm not proud of, but it's helped me understand myself better. Why I do this, why I don't do that, and why I'm resistant to this. And it's like, oh, okay, so I'm not a bad person. I had these experiences in childhood, or I grew up this way and I had this value, and now I've disentangled it from this thing, but not that. I'm being generic here because I don't want to get overly personal. But I think that ultimately, it's about changing the way your mind works, or at least understanding it. Mm-hmm. And that was the name of the docuseries about psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. And ultimately, that's what the goal of therapy is, right? And most psychological interventions is the idea of saying, well, this is the way my mind works, and I'd like it to work a little differently. So if drugs help you get there, great. I mean, you don't want to pop a pill every day just to feel differently. But at the same time, mental health is a direct result of chemistry in our brain, neurotransmitters being released and hitting their receptors and then being recycled or not, that's all chemistry. We are chemicals. And so understanding those, the more we can understand them, the more we have opportunities to work with our chemistry rather than against it.
All right. So what's the last word here on this debate over monogamy versus non-monogamy in humans? I think you kind of got to it at the very beginning of the show, but anything else that you would want people to take away from this question about whether humans are meant to be monogamous or non-monogamous?
I think we're perfectly capable of being happy in any of these settings. I think the key is to decide these things in a thoughtful way, to really explore and think about it, think it through, decide what you can handle and what you can't. Some people are very clear that they can't handle, one thing or the other. Knowing that, being honest with yourself and others, I think it's all good. It's all okay. I really yearn for that future where everybody, constructs their life and their relationship in their own way, and we don't judge each other based on that. Because I see, having been a part of these conversations the last couple of years, both sides of the monogamy debate can very quickly get very nasty. Just, you have no moral fiber, or you're so restrictive, or, it's always just, they can't describe it in neutral ways. It's always
or you're
just
not evolved enough, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a right answer to this. And unfortunately, there's not. But that's a good thing, too. I like having a species where we're all so different. We all approach these things differently. And I think that's always been our strength, by the way, as a species, is that we're not all the same.
I'm with you. I'm not an advocate for monogamy or non-monogamy. I'm an advocate for you finding the type of relationship that works best for you.
Amen.
So thanks so much for your time today, Nathan. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Well, if you Google Nathan Lentz, I think I'm the only one out there that's that's doing this kind of stuff. So I am on social media. I'm just not very active. I don't like social media, to be honest. But I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky. Just nominally, I'm there, Nathan Lentz or Nathan Lentz 15. But if you Google me and you go to the Human Evolution blog, that's really the best way, because I send a newsletter out about once a month. So sign up for the Human Evolution blog, and then you'll see what I'm up to. And pretty much everything I write ends up on that blog eventually.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.